Thank you. My name is Keith Lewis. I'm an alcoholic. I'm really delighted to be here. I really appreciate being asked to do anything for Alcoholics Anonymous. It's always an honor, and I especially appreciate being asked to do it at the beach. It's at the double R on a golf course. It's compounded. I just want to thank Mary Kay and Rom and for inviting the committee for inviting Julie and I and I'd like to thank John and Chris for being such good hosts and hostesses, and just everybody involved with this for just this wonderful time. We went some asked this evening, and we were talking on the way back about what a nice, relaxed, laid back event this is, and it's really one of the fine events I've been doing this for 20 years, and this is really one of the fine events I've ever been privileged to be invited to, and I profoundly thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I see so many friends, Ted and Michael, and Uncle Mikey Way, and my friend Ross from up in Washington, and just so many friends that I have here. Wallace back there in Stanford, who I've known since I moved to North Carolina, and just so many people, and it's just really, really special being here. I want to thank the speakers I've heard too. Brenda was just wonderful Thursday night. If you missed her, I urge you to please buy the tape. It's a powerful message. And I hadn't seen you in 4 or 5 years, and it's just great to see you again and to do that. And I hadn't heard Ruby, but I had the privilege to share with her better half. It's our turn, and it's great to see you again. It's really great to meet you, and your events last night. It was just such a moving experience for me, and so funny too. Really, really hilarious, and I'm looking forward to hearing Pact. And so I'm full. I've got everything I need already, so I'm reading. Thank you. This is about me, after all. I'm not from the South. I know it may grab some of you as a surprise you, but I'm really not. I'm a naturalized citizen. I married a woman from North Carolina. I'd like you to meet my Al-Anon. Julia, would you stand up here? I came south. I came south. Mike always tells me I married above my station. I came south in search of a wife and found them. I was also running from things that do. It's another story. I'm actually born in Ohio, birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous and the Wright brothers. That's about it. I'm the second child, the eldest son in a family of 11 children. I'm Irish. I won't tell you what church we went to. I will, however, give you a hint. It's got something to do with bingo, but I'm not going to say any more. And I guess we were poor. At least I thought we were. And I thought that for many years. I used to sit in the bar inside of the persons that would listen to me and tell them what a rough life I had, and him brothers and sisters, and on and on and on and on. The problem with all of that is it wasn't true. The town is there, but it just wasn't true. Now we didn't have any except material good, but I certainly wasn't poor because I grew up in a family with tremendous loss. A family will play together the rosary every night. That my parents were genuinely interested in everything that was going on in my life. So I get just wonderful brothers and sisters like that. And I grew up in a small town on the Ohio River, and everybody was your parent. And everyone would correct you, and then they call your parents to tell you that they had corrected you. So you always did double duty when you. And I was surrounded by wonderful people my whole life. And the problem with me was I was an alcoholic, and what that means to me is that I'm incapable of responding to the love that's around me. I just don't see it. It's something wrong with my vision. I can always see what's wrong, and I can never see what's right. And somehow I couldn't experience any of that. And from a very early age, I had a bad speech impediment, and from a very early age, I spent all of my time alone. as much as possible. I was a guy who had some lives under his bed. I don't know if they had any of those in the South, but there was something down there, and I could at night I'd press my little ear against the mattress and I could hear it moving around, and I knew what it was down there for. It was waiting for me to dangle my little legs over the side of the bed. I was history, and I knew that, and I also knew I couldn't talk about it. I knew that that there were certain things you can't talk about, and nobody ever told me that. I just intuitively knew that, and so I was the only one who was aware of this thing under my bed, and I used to lay there at night and think about it, worry about it. I worried about other things when I was a little kid. So I worried about getting married because I didn't like girls. I was about 4, and I just didn't like them. And then I knew I had to marry one of them one day, and I knew I had to get a job, probably in the mill, where my dad worked, or in the coal mine. And I watched people going in and out of the mill, and none of them were like me. They were all bigger, and I thought I got to get a job to support this woman I don't want to marry, and I just really labor over these things. I couldn't talk, and I couldn't be understood. Only my parents could understand what I said, and they thought I was wonderful. And my mother passed away recently, but you know how you think back over these kinds of. I was in first grade, and the nuns. Oh, I gave it away. The nun said, "Is there anyone here who would like to sing a song for us?" And I put out my hand, and my mother just strummed, And she said, "What would you like to sing?" And I said, "I want to sing You're a Grand Old Fag." So I say, "You're a grand old fag, you're a high-flying fag," and my mother just wept from the beauty of it, no. And she told me that night, she said, "Son, I've never been more proud of you in my life. I was today when you sang and for all those people." And, to her, I was more. And it scared the hell out of you, but, and they tried to teach me to talk. And so finally I went to the library, and I asked the librarian, who talked real good, and when she said Winston Churchill. So I got those records. I don't know if you remember, I used to have red records in the library. And I'd go home and play Winston Churchill, and I'd try to talk like him. I was the only kid in Ohio Valley with a British accent. And I also, I like to talk about my first drinking experience. I think it's important if you're going to be an Alcoholics Anonymous to have a drinking experience. And I question some of the people coming to my home group, but that's a different topic. But my first drinking experience took place when I was 5 years old. I was at home. I didn't go out much when I was 5, and it was with my father and my brother, Dumb Denny. And Dumb Denny's a year younger than I am. And the mom was out. She was either at the bingo or having a baby or something. And Dad was watching us, and he gave us each a beer. I guess he thought it'd been sort of cute, and I drank it, and nothing happened. Denny, on the other hand, had a spiritual awakening. Last time I saw Denny, he slid out of the chair. He was rolling around under the table, singing Mary Had a Little Lamb, other drinking songs, and my father panicked, and he wrestled him to the ground and got his clothes off and took him up and put him in bed, and Denny was having a great time. He's singing and carrying on and laughing. And so he said, "We get ready for bed, son." And I said, "Okay, Dad." He said, "If you don't tell your mother about this, I'll take you to the movies next weekend." And I thought, well, that's a good deal. When you're 5, they don't negotiate much with you. And so I went with that in bed. Denny wasn't here, and I was watching the thing in arena. I'll never forget this as long ago. Old Denny stood out in a little crib and urinated on the floor, And I remember thinking, there's a kid who's powerless over alcohol, and he'd like us to come and manage him. And I'm sad to report that Denny just never made it. He just never developed beyond that. It's a sad thing, really. He went on just some strange things. I'll share some of the things he did. I'll tell his story. I'm tired of mine. He did things like this. Denny went to, you ready? He went to one college. Yeah. He had one major. He graduated in 4 years. Went to one graduate school. graduated at the top of his class. He was offered like 8 jobs, and he took one. Well, and last year, last year he retired. He's 53 years old. He retired as vice president of a large international corporation. And the strangest thing of all is he married one woman. Here's a guy who had the world in the palm of his hands when he was 4 years old. He just wanted to slip through his fingers, you know? I had to work at this thing. I was 23 years old before I urinated on the bedroom floor for the first time. The other thing I remember was I remember I was in high school, and Julia came back. Julia and I have been married coming up on 9 years, and shortly after we were married, we had occasion to go back to Ohio for a wedding, and I grew up in this little high school I went to, St. John's Central High School, and it was really it's a tiny little, you know, places are small when you go back, and I was reminded of this nun we had. It was a really strange bird. Her name was Sister Victoria, and I like to think about Sister Victoria because Sister Victoria was a librarian, and she's a strange woman. She'd say really off-the-wall things like, every boy is a prince, and every girl's a princess, because we have a father who's a king. Isn't that weird? And so we run around calling each other Prince Keith and Princess Mary, and she was, like I say, the librarian, and she used to walk around this library like it was a library of Congress. I mean, there's a tiny little room with some old books in it. That to her, it was where God would have her be. She was in the midst of doing God's will, and to her, that was paradise. And she's just one of these enthusiastic people. And when you served attention, you used to serve it with Sister Victoria. And I was, well, if we had any money, I think I'd have been diagnosed as an acting out adolescent. We were poor, so I was just a punk. And so I spent a lot of time going to detention with Sister Victoria. What they used to do is they'd make us make rosary beads. They give you wire and beads and flyers, and you make these rosary beads. Those are things that Catholics pray on for your hair kick. And there were 10 beads to every decade and this stuff, you know. And so she put me behind a magazine rack. She said I was a prince, but I was contagious. So I sat back there and I made rosary beads for 4 years, and mine were different. I made them with 11 beads and all the decades. And so, you know, by the time they take these rosary beads and they'd ship them all over the world for mission. So by the time I graduated, there were hundreds of rosary beads out there. And you know, you can't let them not know what you're doing. And when it came time to graduate, she hadn't caught on yet. So I went to inform her. And I said, you know what I've been doing for the last 4 years, sister? And she said, yes, I do, you sly little prince. That you've been putting extra beads in all the decades of the rosary, and I know why you've been doing it. And I remember thinking, I hope she tells me, because I haven't the foggiest idea why I do her. And she said, people all over the world are praying extra prayers, and God's going to give you all the credit. Ooh. Don't you hate people like that, Then she said something that just terrified me, absolutely terrified me. She took both of my hands in her hands, and she said to me, she said, when I first met you, I knew you were a special little prince. And she said, I put a metal on my beads. They were these long beads. Remember, they bang them against the desk where you're taking a test. And she put a medal of St. Jude, who was the patron saint of lost causes, on that thing. And she said, whenever I get to this medal, I say a special prayer for you. And she said that one day God's going to send you all over the world, and you're going to tell all his children how very much he loves them. I was terrified. I was just terrified. I couldn't talk. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I mean, everybody in the world knew what they wanted to do but me. And so I left home. I mean, you know, if you don't know what you're going to do, and you leave home, they won't know you don't know what you're going to do. They'll think you're doing it. And so I told him back then, you know, the way you last told me was you joined the service. All men went into the service. It wasn't if, it was where and when. Those were the 8 things. And so I took my very first inventory. I stood in front of the mirror, I took my shirt off, and I flexed my muscles, and I turned sideways and stuck my chest out. And I was 5 feet 1 inch tall, and I weighed 113 pounds. And whatever else I was a born killer. So So I joined the Marine Corps. And, yeah. Oh, my parents, I was 17, they had a sign for me. My mother just about had a nervous breakdown. She cried all night. All night she kept saying, Scott, they'll kill him. And my dad kept saying, don't worry, Pat, they won't take him. You know? So, so the next morning, with that vote of confidence, we got in a taxi cab and went to the bus station in Wheeling, West Virginia. And I took a bus from Wheeling, West Virginia to Pittsburgh. And it's the second longest trip I'd ever been on. It was 60 miles. And I was terrified. I didn't know anything about anything, you know. It was a real bad year, and they took if you had a pulse. And so that afternoon, I was sworn in the Marine Corps. Now, you heard some pretty disparaging words about the Marine Corps last night. Something to do with venereal disease and things like that. I feel it's fair to point out a few things, okay? Now, I was in the Marine Corps for 4 years, okay? I never caught a venereal disease. I got drunk before you did what you do to catch a venereal disease. But I know a lot of guys who did have venereal disease. And we talked about this for a long time. Every guy would go to a Navy corpsman. They'd come back and say, I have a venereal disease. We finally figured it out. The corpsmen were giving guys venereal disease when they were giving them physicals. So that's how Marines get venereal disease. So yeah, right. That's one of the subjects Ruby didn't cover this morning, so I thought I'd throw it in, Carl. I get that in circumcision. That's about it there. Yeah. But at any rate, that evening, I never knew what to do. I mean, I don't know about you, but I never knew what to do. I thought everybody else did. It wasn't until I got to AA that I found out you didn't know what to do either. But I always thought you knew what to do. It's like you understood the big picture, and I never did. And so I sort of watched you, and I did what you did. Right after you did, I was fat. You thought I had done it with you, but it was just right after you. And so these guys, we get sworn in and stuff, and we're standing around. There are 4 of us, me and 3 guys from Pittsburgh, who had the big fishing. And they said, "Hey, kid, we're thinking about going over and getting you a sandwich and a beer." I was thinking exactly the same thing. Why don't we go together? They said, all right. So we went over to this bar in Pittsburgh, and that's where my life changed. And, if you're alcoholic, you know exactly what I mean. I mean, I went into this place, and it was filled with real men, the kind, they had tattoos and stuff, I had real women wear them. Real women hang around with real men, I knew that. And I followed them over, and I sat down, and the bartender came over. He's a real man. He said, "What do you want?" And I thought, oh my God, it quits. I always knew that when you least expected it, somebody was going to say, "Take out a blank sheet of paper. Put your name in the upper left-hand corner," yeah. And I studied a lot, but I always studied the wrong stuff. I always felt like and I didn't know what to say, so I watched the other guys, and they ordered a beer, so I did too. Years later, a psychologist was to say to me, "Why do you think you drank in the first place?" I scratched her chin, And I thought, that's got to be important, So I remember I got a 5th of scotch, went down by the stream. I drank 5th of scotch, wondering why I drank in the first place. And I went to a bar. By this time, I was hanging out in hillbilly joints on the Indian Head Highway in Maryland. And I said to the guy sitting with me, "Well, tell me, sir, why do you think you drank in the first place?" "Get the hell out of here," he said. Sorry, okay. And I could never figure it out. And I came here and I found out that it didn't matter why I drank. What mattered was what happened to me when I drank. And what happened to me that night was I was liberated for the very first time. Vince described it beautiful that. I was liberated. I somewhere between the second and third drink, I saw the big picture. It's the first time in my life. And I remember saying, it's so simple. Why didn't I see it before? It's been right there the whole time. I just missed it. And I stood up. I didn't mean to stand up. I couldn't keep from standing up. I was about 6 feet 4 inches tall, and I weighed 220 pounds. And, the muscles were rippling through my body and tugging at my shirt. And, unbelievable, And I looked around, and my heart broke. This bar was filled with a bunch of pathetic, sniveling little men. And you know, all of them had women with them or looking at me with those hungry eyes. You know how they do it, and it's incredible. And I just, instant knowledge, those just illuminated. It was amazing to me. And I spent the rest of the night going from table to table, filling these people in. I mean, I answered questions they hadn't thought up yet. I was, oh, that's really brilliant. And somewhere around 11 o'clock at night, or train left at midnight, and somewhere around 11 o'clock at night, I said, we had to leave. And it seemed to me they were saying, please don't go. We've just discovered you. That's the way it seemed. And I said, no, I have to go and make the world shake for democracy. So we got on a train, and presumably the Marine Corps provided me with a Pullman coach. They must have, because I woke up the next morning in a Pullman coach. Well, actually, I was lying on the floor of the Pullman coach, and someone had wet the floor I was lying on. And whoever it was, he had wet me too. I don't know what. And again, I was 5 feet 1 inches tall and I weighed 113 pounds. And again, I was terrified. And I changed clothes, which was a good move. And I got off the train, and the guys were waiting for me on the platform, and they said, hey, look, we're going to go over and have a few beers for breakfast. You want to join us? And I said, that's just exactly what I was thinking. And so I went over there, and that night I fell off the train in a little village right over here called Yamasee. And somebody moved the bottom step or something. I don't know exactly what happened, but I fell across the next set of railroad tracks, and there was a very rude man there they had sent to greet us. And he was hurling obscenities at myself and the other young men who went down there to die for their country. And I remember getting up, and I tried to explain to this cretin that he'd probably do a lot better if he treated us with a little respect. He was so limited; he never really grasped exactly what it was I was trying to say to him. And they say that you can learn from any experience, and I got to tell you, what I learned that night was you can do a lot of push-ups drunk. That's what I learned that night. And you can do a push-up and throw-up at the same time. Okay, yeah. And so that the next morning, I ate grits for the first time. I was telling some friends about it. I never saw grits before. I didn't know what the hell grits were here. So I did what any normal Yankee would do. I put sugar and milk on them. And this cretin looked at me and said, you're going to go far, boy. You're going to go far. And So I was launched into the Marine Corps, and I must say that it was. I loved the Marine Corps. I really did. And it sounds crazy, but I absolutely loved it. There were fewer people in the barracks than there were in my house, and the drill instructors couldn't carry a nun's rosary beads. I mean, they were easy compared to the nuns, but most of all, for the very first time in my life, this sounds strange, but for the very first time in my life, I knew precisely what was expected of me. I never knew my job description, and so I joined the Marine Corps. They're very clear about what's expected of you, and they aren't a bit hesitant about sharing it with you. And I loved it. I loved everything about it. And I grew a few inches and gained a few pounds, and I graduated from Paris on a Dress Blues Award and Outstanding Man's Award. I mean, I really took it. I was the only guy in that whole platoon that just loved it. And I was going to stay for 100 years if they let me. The problem was that I had alcoholism. And let me tell you what having alcoholism means to me. It means that I'll fall in love with a way of life, tremendously enthusiastic about life. And every alcoholic I know is just tremendously enthusiastic about life. And then gradually, or not so gradually, I began to violate every principle associated with being in the Marine Corps. Before my 4 years were over, I had earned an opportunity to go to Officers Candidate School. And I turned it down and got out because within 4 years, I violated every principle associated with being a Marine, up to and including leading a combat patrol in a blackout. Who took fire? I don't remember it, but fortunately, nobody is certain. So I violated virtually every principle associated. And what I'd do then is I'd leave that way of life, and then I'd blame them for what had happened to me. And that's my alcoholism. It lasted 12 years. In that 12 years, I did more damage than I think a human being ought to be allowed to do to the people close to me. I've joined many areas alike, including marriage. I violated every principle associated with being married. When my first daughter, Kelly, was born, she had a good sense to be born in the daytime, so I was so. When my second daughter, Kimberly, was born, she was 3 months premature. And I was passed out on the living room floor. and my wife had thrown water on me to try to wake me up, and she couldn't. So in a panic, she got the neighbor. So when I came to, I was laying in my underwear watching a test pattern, and the neighbor standing there looking at me. I was just infuriated, and I knew that if she'd had that baby on time, I'd have been all right. And she'd have waited till I was all right. She'd have carried that baby for 2.5 years. But the amazing thing was I worked at a great teaching hospital at the time, and I got her in a car and we raced drunk and we raced across Washington D.C. with the flashes going and all the drama that the drunk didn't generate. And I got her to the emergency room and I began to demand that they take care of my wife. I directed the genetics unit at this laboratories at this place. I began to demand that they take care of my wife. And I think of how mortified she was, terrified to begin with, having this baby almost 3 months early, and she's mortified having this drunken husband who was arrogant and everything, and so the baby was born and weighed about 2 pounds, or a little less than 2 pounds, and I went home and went to bed, and as soon as I went to bed, the phone rang. It was her, and she was crying and said, "The baby has hyoid disease, and they don't expect her to live. Would you please come back?" I remember how angry I was. I felt put out. I didn't know how to handle these things. My father knew how to do these things. He knew how to be a father. I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't know how to be a husband. I didn't know any of these things. And I went back, and in a wonderful position, a girl I'd gone to high school with the chief president, the neonatal nursery, and it was a wonderful physician there who headed that service. And in 3 days before Kimberly was born, they bought an experimental machine. It was the first one on the East Coast. It's called a negative respirator, very common now. But it was developed, I think, with UCLA, and it was the very first one they had on the East Coast. And it was coming 3 days before Kimberly was born, and a day or so before she was born, they came in on their own time with an engineer, and they put it together. And David, this doctor, said to me, my wife by this time was in a state of shock. She looked like 1,000 right there. And David said to me, would you mind if he put her on it? He said, I don't think she'll live. And if she does live, I think she'll be retarded because of the lack of oxygen. But you mind if he put her on the machine? And they knew I wouldn't sue them because they worked there. And I said, do whatever you feel you need to do. And then I found out what had happened to me, how low I had sunk. Our offices were across the hall from the neonatal nursery. And I sat in there at night, and I didn't drink for a few days. And I sat in there at night, and I kept the door slightly ajar, sat in the dark, and I watched this little kid struggle for every breath. And these little kids retract, what they call retract, and they actually lift off the little mattresses and the things. And I was there, 72 hours is a critical time, and I was there watching when my wife went into this nursery and baptized her baby because they didn't think she'd issue. And I couldn't know them. And I hated myself. I sat there and loathed myself for what I'd become, the coward I'd become. And I went downstairs to a chapel, and I got in front of the tabernacle, and I hadn't been there in a while. I hadn't been there in a long time. My alcoholism cost me my religion too. And I got on my knees in front of the tabernacle. And when I was a little kid, this was a special praise for me, because I knew that even when I couldn't talk plain, God understood. And I got in front of the tabernacle, and I begged him to let this little girl live. And I said, I'll do anything you'll let her live. Anything. If you'll let her live, I'll stop drinking. And I was drunk in less than 24 hours. I drank when I thought drinking would kill my little baby. And I could not. There's a great philosopher and a mathematician, Blade Pascal, a Frenchman, who probably is the last good Frenchman, but the Frenchman who said something that sort of fit me. He said, God created man in his own image, and unfortunately man was turned to baby. And I had created a God in my own image, and that was a God who would kill a little baby because her father is sick. And God didn't kill this little baby, and she survived, and it was absolutely miraculous. And she's 28 years old, and she's not retarded. She's an honor graduate from Auburn University. I always point out to her that I think you can be a graduate, an honor graduate from Auburn and still be retarded, but she and her husband, claim not. He's a dentist. No, he doesn't work on my cheek, but he's a dentist. And and they live in a little town in Alabama, Daphne, Alabama, and just great kids. And just this Christmas, they presented Julie and I with a little granddaughter, and I'm glad it God not look like me. Um, you can't live like that and and survive. And my wife knew that it wasn't safe for me to be around the kid. I, one day I needed a drink badly, and my wife wasn't there, and I left 4 month old kid in the crib because I needed a drink, and on and on and on. And I knew I was just hopeless. I knew that if a guy can't stop drinking to save his child's life, how can he stop drinking? And she asked me to leave, and I was greatly relieved. I could no longer carry the responsibility, even poorly, and I was just greatly relieved. She asked me to leave, and I packed 2 bags, and I went to where I needed to go. And now this in Kidlow section of Washington D.C. And during that 6 months, I remember the one time that I remember seeing her with Thanksgiving Day. I didn't know it was Thanksgiving, and I got up, and you know the drill. I woke up in a room I've been recognized next to warm bodies. Yeah. I remember when I first thought we cried Leslie a woman. That was my first thought. I didn't know her time, but new fellow for Lou, and then you went through the embarrassment of acting like you remembered, and she didn't remember, and I didn't remember, and I got up and got dressed. That thick feeling, that loathing, the depression, and condemnation. I was walking down the street. I went by a free clinic in George County, and the woman asked me if I wanted a cup of coffee, and I got a cup of coffee, and she said to me, "Happy Thanksgiving." When I realized it was Thanksgiving, and I went down the street to find a payphone, and with us, about 2 couples standing on the corner of Wisconsin and N Street, which they stand there talking, and I walked up to them and spoke with them, and they nicked at me. I didn't think they could see me. I didn't state that I was a present to them. I don't know if you know what I mean. And they just sort of looked at me, and I was embarrassed, and I walked away, and I found a phone, and I called my estranged wife and said, could I come out to Thanksgiving? And she said, if you don't drink, you come here at 6 o'clock. So 6 o'clock, I didn't drink all day, and at 6 o'clock, I went out and knocked on his door, and he opened the door, gave me a bag of turkey sandwiches and closed the door. And I got a tic tac when I went to the car, and sat on his curb and farted and ate my turkey sandwiches and drank my beer. And that was the last Bofors gathering that I had for 50. And I know how hard it was for her to do that. I know how hard it was for her to even give me a thing to what I'd done to her. I brutalized her emotionally, physically, every way you could think of. I robbed her of everything that mattered. And I went to where I needed to go. And one day, I won't talk about drinking. You know how to drink. But one day, I got up and it was over. And it's just over. I always used to think suicide was a big deal. But, for an alcoholic, it's just the next thing. I kind of think that I'd pay whatever it costs to go to Pittsburgh, because I never forget that night in Pittsburgh, of course, night. And one day I was in the NTO club, and I said, give me a double scotch. And the guy said, that'll be 70 cents in your Marine Corps free. And I thought, well, that's about right. So I paid it. And, one day I probably wanted a bottle of gin or something, and I could, give me a bottle of Tanqueray gin. And he said, well, that'll be $8 in your wife and your children. I thought, well, that's about right, to get to Pittsburgh. And then one day I'm living in the Skid Row section of Washington, D.C. And I don't know, and I bought Trump, who knows what. And he said, it'll be your life. And I thought, well, that's about right. And it's just the next thing. It's the next price. That's all. And I went on May the 13th, 1973. I went in what passed as a bathroom where I was living in front of a mirror. And Mike remembers that place well, And I said aloud, I had all these pills I was going to take. And I never cooked pills. I worked in hospitals, and they gave me a bunch of pills, and I never cooked them. Brenda thinks that's the saddest story she ever heard, but I just never took them. And I decided I'd take them all. And I said aloud, you're 29 years old, and I leaped through the over. And this woman's voice outside of me, it startled me. Say, when you're 29, it's not supposed to be ill. And I remembered that my ex-wife had given me a phone number when I left. And she said, I can't help you. Maybe you need people that can. And she gave me 2 numbers. And I ran out and I pulled the drawer out and everything fell on the floor. And I found one of the numbers and I called it. It was a little treatment center outside of Washington, D.C. Now, I know there are people at Anatolium, people who don't have an opinion on outside issues. She criticized treatment centers. But I'm not one of them, because if that plate hadn't have been there, I'm convinced I'd degrade. And then a woman answered the phone and she knew precisely how to talk to me. She knew exactly how to talk to me. And she knew I was suicidal. And she asked me for my phone number. And she could, I'll call you right back. And I know the trick with Chris was to find out my phone number because I could trace you. And she called me back and she told me that I could come in 3 days. Then she said a strange thing to me. Do you need trouble stopping drinking? And do you need help stopping drinking? Do you think you have trouble? And I thought, I don't know what she's talking about. I'd never stop. And I found out what she's talking about. I heard those things and saw those things and had to get some money. And for 3 days, I heard Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Lovely piece of music, but not for 3 days. And it was coming out of the strangest places. Like I'd park my car and I put money in the parking meter and Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I'd say, wow, it's worth a quarter, you know? And I went to the bank to get some loan on an alcoholic car, and I'm listening, you know, really getting into it. And I realized they didn't have Muzak. I was the only one who was hearing this beautiful music. And then I saw those things as a corny rider with dart owls and that sort of thing. And somehow I knew that the end of 3 days that it was up. And I got in my car and I drove out to this place. And it was 30 miles away. And Mike and I had driven it many, many times. That morning, it took me 6 hours to drive 30 miles because I had what they used to call the running fit. You know, we call them anxiety attacks, but then there was the running fit. And I wet my camp and I flew up and I could only go for about a mile and I'd start to shake and everything. And it took me a long time to get out there and I finally got out there. And that night, they put me on a bus and took me to a place called Alcoholics Anonymous. And, you know, like Brenda, I never knew Alcoholics Anonymous existed. I never knew a thing about it. I thought it was an old organization. My ex-wife had found an old book in the trash room, Alcoholics Anonymous, and I thought it was a history of an organization that existed in the 30s. But they learned so much more since then, and they did away with it. And so they put me on a bus and take me to Alcoholics Anonymous, and then my life changed. It was like my trip to Pittsburgh. And I'll never forget, there was a man standing at the door, a strange guy, you know, sort of an obnoxious kind of guy. He looked in the eye. You know, there are a lot of them around here, you know, look in the eye. I was a shoe guy. I looked at shoes, but this guy's looking in the eye and he's shaking my hands, you know, and he shook my hand. I kind of looked away, like he had 2 heads. Every place I looked, he's looking me in the eye. And he said a strange thing to me. He said, you know, son, he said, first he said, you're new, aren't you? And I thought, my God, he's psychic. You know? And then he said, if you keep coming here, you never have to drink again. Or I wanted to scream at him. What do you know? I'm a guy who drinks when he thinks drinking until it's bed. What do you know? He knew what I didn't know. And that is that the God of my understanding and put me here. Because with you, I don't have to grace again. And from that day to Rispel, you kept your promise. By the grace of God and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and a series of pretty mean sponsors. One I share with Wallace and Mark and a few others. I don't have to. And it began an odyssey. And if you kind of knew, you know, I don't expect you to believe this because I would never have believed it. I admire anybody who's sober a week and can sit in a room. I couldn't sit in a room. I couldn't be around people a week. I mean, I just couldn't do it. I mean, I'd be hanging from the ceiling someplace or something. So I'd really admire you being here. But if you don't remember anything else, please remember that all of us were sober 1 week. Wallace was sober 34 years, was sober 1 week once. And I was sober 1. And all the people you see here are members of Alcoholics Anonymous have been sober for 1 week. We wouldn't lie about something as precious as that. We couldn't lie if we weren't sober. I mean, we could lie, but nobody would believe us, you know. And we couldn't show up here and not try it and things like that. So please believe that something that happens here is very, very special. Now, that you don't catch it like Gunda Corman catching venereal disease. You don't see that. You have to do what Ben said last night, you know. You have to work these steps. You have to become part of this Just saying. And if you don't want to be, that's normal because I was isolated. I was really isolated, and people would ask silly questions like, "What do you like?" I had no idea what I liked. I knew what I thought I was supposed to like, but I had no idea or what I liked. And what I did was I immersed myself in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I finally got a sponsor. I like Vince as one of those people who waited to get a sponsor. And the old timers won't leave you alone. One guy kept saying to me, said, "You got a sponsor yet?" And I said, "No, not yet." He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, frankly, I've been waiting to find someone I can relate to." Back in the early 70s, Vince tell you relate was important. And he said, "You want someone to relate to? Go to a bar." He said, "If you want to," he said, "what you need to do is find a man you want to be like if and when you grow up and ask him to be your sponsor." I thought, well, I wonder what I did to offend this man. That's the way the old timers were. And I'll tell you, if you're new, well, it is an honest program. Let me caution you, stay away from the old timers. Okay? I mean it, right? They were guys like Mike and Vince and guys and Wallace, guys like it. Stay away from them. They're not nice people. They're really not. And I'm telling you the truth. And they say things that just aren't true. They say stuff like, "I go to AA because I need to." That's a lie. They don't need to go to AA. The only reason they go to AA is the only enjoyment they get out of life is watching people like you and me suffer. It's the truth. It's true. If you don't believe me, go up to Milt after the meeting and tell him the problem. You know what he'll do? He'll laugh. The first thing he'll do is he'll laugh. And if you really want to make your day, come with problem related to sex. They love problems related to sex, Your answer's always the same thing: no sex. Huh? They don't have sex anymore. They don't want us to have it either. And they always speak you in parables. You ever notice that? They always speak you in parables, Say, well, look, I can't sleep at night. The world moves slowly. Yeah, right. And I remember I used to go to this old fool. I don't know why. I just a sucker for punishment. But I go to this old fool with my problem. But he just get the biggest kick out of it. And I was incident when I got sober. It happened to a lot of men, and I wasn't happy about it. I mean, I can't drink in this too. And I went to this guy. I him and on fun. He said, "What's the problem?" I said, "That's the problem." Oh, he loved it. He said, "I happen to love, so get better." I said, "When?" I thought it was important, And he said, "What do you got, a full social calendar?" So then I go to the same idiot. You think I'd learn, I go to the same idiot with another problem. He said, "You got a lot of problems, don't you?" I said, "I really do." I said, "That's thousands of problems." He said, "Well, I'll tell you what I want you to do." He said, "I want you to borrow lipstick from one of the girls." He said, "I don't want you to do anything else for a girl." He said, "Oh, that's right, you can't." I want you to borrow lipstick. I want you to go home right on the mirror. Keith, you are wrong. I said, "Well, I can't do that. You see, my problem is I have a poor self-image and I need to be affirmed." Don't ever talk that way to an old time. They hadn't read any of those books, And so I went and I bought it to the lipstick. I didn't want to owe anything to anybody, especially a woman, like guys. And so I went home and I wrote on the mirror, "Keep you along." And I threw the way out, just the stuff like these people are not insane, And I went to bed and I had a normal night. You remember a normal night at 60 days? Oh, I lay down and closed my eyes, and for the first time that night, my head woke up. Cake off, It was talking to you. "You're never going to make it. They're going to find out you're crazy. That's your problem. Even you, all this that. You're going to be alone, and that's your life. What difference does that make? You're impotent." And, I finally gripped off to sleep, and then remember the leg cramps? Oh, I'd be jumping up and down beside the bed with leg cramps. And then 15 minutes before I had to get up, I was sound asleep, And it would take 3 alarm clocks to wake me up. Everybody in the neighborhood got up when I got up, but my mind was still working, and it was saying, "You're going to go to work today, and they're going to find out you don't know how to do your job." What difference does it make? You're hopelessly in debt. Just the normal stuff. How when I started coffee, he just wanted to clap my rib. I went in the bathroom and listened to near it. They keep through a log. I thought, thank God, because if I'm lying, I'm in a hell of a lot of trouble, and I get mocked. And I began to scream in the phone, well, Mr. Fulbright Stolly, one of us is leaving here in a few minutes, and the other one's going to go back to his cell and get locked up. And Dan thought it was really inappropriate, and he was trying to take the phone away from me, but I wasn't finished. And I got down on my knee, titling the phone, and I'm singing at this side, and the other desk started looking in our cubicles at us, too, what was going on, and finally the guards came over. They were furious about what was happening. Dan finally got the phone away from me, and he said to the guy, yeah, I'll come back tomorrow. Yeah, I'll come alone. I'll come alone. Hung up the phone. And I just knew I was going to be drummed out of Alcoholics Anonymous. I knew it. And so we left, and I'm waiting. I'm just waiting, And he's not saying anything. It just makes you crazy. And so finally I got over to the car, and I could, that was pretty bad running the door. You know what he said? He said, Keith, I'll be honest with you. He said, most guys wouldn't have done it that way. He said to me, you'll discover that we all develop our own technique now, Alcoholics Anonymous. I never heard another thing about it. Never heard another thing about it. Early on, I figured out about sponsors. A sponsor's job is to find out the desire of your heart and then not let you do it. I am. That's what they're designed to do. And I was working. I'm working my way out of the deep hole at Georgetown University, and I was again in charge of experimental design and that sort of thing for the genetics function. And I was just sort of working my way back in, and they were just wonderful to me. That shouldn't have been nice to me. And as a matter of fact, Sherman Cardin was a member of our fellowship, and I didn't know it. Well, I resigned from the university, and remember their culturally advisor, but he was just wonderful. He arranged for me to do a scholarship. He got me a scholarship over it, and I didn't know he'd made it at the time. I was over about a year, and he called me to his office. Of course, they could fire me, and they never got in. Damn my office, not the only fired. He told me what a wonderful job he was doing, and he said, I'd like to give you a raise, Keith, but the wage in Christ Street here then. And he said, so what I want to do is give you this instead. It was a full tuition scholarship. I could have gone to medical school anyway. And the desire of my heart was to study philosophy, with the Georgetown University. And so I did a degree in philosophy and theology, and I had to work at the same time. But what the hell? I mean, we weren't drinking. Get working and going to business sometimes to beat the cake because they're not drinking. But all I did is go to Saturday meeting for the 8th, and I'm interested in Beavery, and compared to the life I think murdered. But I for about 3 months, and I got a letter from a man named Jerome Lejeune. He died last year. Probably one of the greatest psychologists who ever lived. It's just an extraordinary man. He wrote me and invited me to come to his laboratory at University of Paris Medical School in France to study. And I knew that Mike Fonset wouldn't let me go. That's something I really wanted to do. So I was just going to turn it down. And I thought, nah, hell, give him a pen. So we went to lunch, And after I paid, I didn't have the money, I could. And after lunch, I gave him this letter. And he read it, and the eye filled up with big. And he said, my God, what the boy? And I said, you mean I can tell? He said, you have to go. He said, this isn't about you. He said, the best thing to crap your pants when a kid road dive and, on Harbor Street. He said, this is about Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, the difference between then, now, the Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, citizens here. He said, this is still all of us Alcoholics Anonymous can celebrate the miracle of recovery. And I didn't see that Missouri. He said, you have to go. And he said, and let me tell you something. I never forgotten it. And if you knew, please hear it. He said, Keith, you can do anything in the world as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous if you prepare profit. And we began to prepare profit for me to go to France instead. New York Day, 1974, planes that are through the thighs from the airport. The first time I've ever been on a plane over. And I was sailing through the clouds in the Raleigh airport. And I'm glad I was by myself in the corner of feet because I couldn't treat them car. And that day I walked a tree for 3 days. I'd been embarrassed before, but I couldn't leave the bars in the hotel I was buried. I put it in park. And I was there a couple months, and wouldn't you believe it? What a coincidence. Mike wanted they brute. And we picked a train ride down to down to Tarker to see the beautiful theater, and he taught me his late lesson about fear. I was remember fear of heights, and I thought that the way you dealt with fear was you were brave. You know, you kept kicking it into that brave. And that's how you dealt with the fear of height. And he would tell me that we could go to the top of the gazebo in a catwalk and look down into this magnificent thing, and right away my heart stopped. And I began to get brave. You know, when I was in the Marine Corps and I was afraid of heights, I didn't tell anybody. And I tried to go to jump to because I figured jump out of airplanes, you won't be afraid of heights. And I busted a kidney a few months before that, overcoming another fear. So they wouldn't let me go to jump school, so I went to mountain climbing. But I spent a month in the Sierra Nevada in the middle of winter. We're calling off the side the silk drunks. And the guy I'm refelling with said, I'm not climbing as you anymore, you're drunk. And I said, I'm a hell of a lot better off drunk than I am terrified. And I could look both lucky. He said, I'm not lucky enough to climb with you anymore in both. And what I discovered was that being brave was just a pushing it to fear. I always thought it was. It didn't be, right? No, I started to get brave. And then I stopped. Since I've been a member of All Hearts now for over 6 months now, and I knew there was a different way to do them. When I said to Dan, I said, Dan, I can't go up there because I'm a certified. And he said, oh, you got the old crate of heights problem. I said, a lot of us attest. I said, really? Oh, yeah, well, I was said that. He says, you know, you don't have to go up there. School doesn't matter. We can, or, here's a novel concept. We'll go part where? He said, or, you'll go until you're afraid, we need to take my word. And that's how we did it. I went until I took a boat and I took a camera and we went to the car. And everything that I said, as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, I done it because I've taken someone's hand and brought me apart. I could do nothing before I met you. Nothing. Except make big plans and talk big and make excuses why I get right. And you know the thing, if you're new, the thing about Alcoholics Anonymous, you don't have a problem we can't hurt you with. And we don't have it far. You know, we may refer you to somebody who knows more about it. But you don't have a problem that's going to talk up to him to refill, asking me to do anything but to keep coming. And that's what it is. I mean, I don't care what your problem is. There's nothing that's going to scare us off. Because he needs you here. You know, I remember one time I had that sleeping problems when I got covered and my brain was getting hurt. I was driving to work one day. It's a true story. I forgot where I was. I said about 2 months, I forgot where I was. And I try to remember, and the more I try to remember, the crazier it got me, you know. And I had being phone number, he made me carry a card and take the dime the card and made me carry it. And so I called him, and I didn't want him to think that I was as sick as I was, because I didn't think he wanted to sponsor a guy with problems. Yeah. So he answered the phone, and I said, good morning, Dan. He said, Keith, is that you? And I said, yeah. He said, what's the problem? I said, no problem, Dan. I was wondering how you're doing. He said, I'm fine, Keith. He said, what's all that noise? That's what I'm calling you from a phone bit. He said, tell me, buddy, did your car break down? I said, no, car's fine. I was wondering how you're been. And he said, Keith, what's the problem? Like, well, it's not a real big problem, Dan. I just can't remember where I work. And he said to me, he said, oh, you got the old can't remember where I work problem, right? A lot of us have had that. You know. But then he said to me, so, because that's scary, I know. It was scary. He said, but he said, you know, you've done great damage. He said, the victims of the very unnatural thing, you feel that much alcohol and I'm praying for you. He said, but I'm going to keep in mind. He said, you're going to be okay. And he said, you know, your brain's going to readjust. You'll be okay. He said, one day you'll laugh at it, but you're sure he's throwing positive. He said, man, make a suggestion. I said, anything. I'm honest, willing, and open-minded. And he said, if you ever have this problem, then he said, you just remember to look on the front bumper of your car. You have a parking permit for the university. And I remember thinking, where do these people learn these games? No? They make it look so easy. You're on down. Let me we'll talk a little bit about the steps, and I want to talk in particular about the 8th and 9th step. Well, there's just so much. This time next month, by the grace of God and fellowship of alcohol, I'll be sober 25 years, and that just been happening. And And I never planned to stay here 25 years. I mean, I really didn't because I didn't have a here. If I'd have known that the treasure trove of the great wealth that it is, I would have made plans to stay here. But they were my plans to stay here. What I did was I fell in love with who and what you are. And I get the fire to be like you, that's all. And it's in one of the things that you grew to be filled with, to be the taxi. And you know, and I had some people on my death list. I wanted to talk to with government about that repair. One of the people on my except which is them then. And and some years ago I drove in the Denver, New Jersey. Now there's what they call it California. I drove from Washington up to New Jersey to have a talk to Denny, and when we began to talk, and his wife Jan knew that this is a different kind of talk, and she usually talks more to dad, and I was able to tell him how sorry I was for the way I had criticized Kim, and I said, any time that I found any flaw in you at all, I probably capped it to your family. I said, I detracted from you, and I said, you look too good, and I'm everything once, and, you know, you're such a successful guy, and I always felt, you know, I always envied you, and I always felt Phil and Addison around you. And I said, what I've done the last 6 months to tip the opposite, I told him all the good things that are true about you. And I started later to do anything else back in D to take care of the friendship that we once had. I played second base and Denny played shortstop. And you were a wonderful double play combination. We were wonderful brothers. And he just started to laugh. He said, you know, if you owe me an amend, then I owe you an amend. And he said, all my life, I family was blank, sir. He said, all my life I've been afraid. I've been afraid of crime like you. I've been afraid to be people. But you could always done to do keep you never go a shit about anything. He said, if things weren't going well in one country, you go to another country. And he said, you went to Skid Row and you came back. You lost your wife in the silly and you came back. He said, but great. And the fortitude and the character that you portrayed him. You aren't anything I'd ever learned. I discovered that we weren't good and bad, we're just different. And that was back friends. When we played golf, as a matter of fact, last year we won a Golden Putters championship out of this club, and old guys never win that. I mean, young guys from Stanford win that, and when we won it, I mean, we just whipped up on their guys, you know, and it's like the old guys when we won championships, and things like that. It was incredible, and then, you know, I grew up in this church, and this church was so very, very important to me. When I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I was one of those people who was religious and anti-religious. You know, fun. And waiting for somebody to defend me, and by talking about God, and my sponsor pointed out to you that I had a negative attitude about organized religion. And I used to think, I don't like to organize religion. The truth was, I went through the Pope. If I'd have been a Pope, I'd have loved to organize religion, well. And so I put religion on my step list. And I went down to a little retreat center where Mike and I would go quarter to retreat. And I want to look into this young theologian. He would understand the significance of this incredible humble act I was about to perform. And I couldn't find him. And what I found instead was an old priest who was sitting in his lockies there, walking back and forth and reading Weber. And I knocked on his door in Catholic, I caucus him, and his name was Stanley. And he could come in. And I sat down in a rocking chair across him. And I talked to him about Alcoholics Anonymous. I talked to him about the kid that I had lost and everything. And I talked to him about where I'd gone. But most of all, I talked to him about how I ridiculed people like him because I was afraid of them and how I blacked being the church and blacked being God and innocent. And I got about halfway through, and I put his foot there, and he got up and he pulled me up, and he began to pat me, and he began to cry. And he picked done. He said, please stop. He said, I was just acting. He said, I have a disease that's going to allow me to go home, sir. He said, I look at asking God as I understand where I missed it. And he said, he sent you. He said, too often, I stayed with a 99 that's real here, and I didn't go after the one that was lost. I'm sorry who had to be out there all alone. What I know about the 8th and 9th step is it isn't about me. I'm very concerned about some of the things I see in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not going to give a lecture, believe me. But one of the things I'm concerned about is people think it's about coming here to get better for me. And it's not. It's about coming here to become spiritually fit, sincere, and messy with Alcoholics Anonymous. And I pay the messy for holy man's it that 50 years of a crease running right down. The guard would pick a doorful like he carried a message to a hoary man. A note. And now I was free to be in that church and not be in that church or that church. Okay. Prior to that day, I wasn't way the booze. I made a men be up. I put on a creating feet. I went to low cap. I make it down. I bit told that here. Get told her. And I left there knowing I would love the unbelief. And the prince of the king. I went to my father. My father is one of those guys who never told me he loved me. That's what the problem. His mother had a square nipple and father never told me he loved her. And it took me years to. I'd go to make amends to my father, and within a few minutes I'd be in a rage. I used to drive from Washington to Ohio to make amends. And in a few minutes I'd be in a rage, and I'd drink half a cup of coffee, and I'd storm out of the house, get in the car, and drive back to Washington. And my father used to say to my mother, "I'm worried about that boy. He drives a long way for a cup of coffee." And then suddenly one day I knew it was the right time, and I didn't know what I owed him an amends for. I know I'd worried him and I'd done all those things, and I called him names and I'd done all this. And once I almost kid him. Fortunately I didn't. And but I knew what I owed him an amends for, and he was talking to me. He said, "Son, do you remember your first job?" And I said, "Yes, I worked in the bowling alley." I said, "Tim." And he said, "Remember the first day you went to work?" And I said, "No." And he said, "I took you to Louis' hot dog stand. We had lunch together." He said, "Do you remember what you ate?" And I said, "I'm going to go out on a limb, Dad, a hot dog." And he said, "Of course you had a hot dog." He said, "Do you remember what you drank?" And I said, "Well, I only drank orange pop." He said, "Not that day." He said, "That day you had a root beer." He said, "I drank root beer, and I think he thought men who drank or worked drank eat it." And he said, "And I explained to you what it was like to be a good day work for a good day's wage, and that you owed your boss respect, and he owes you respect." But he said, "I explained it all to you." And he said, "You were such a frail little boy." And he thought I was terrified. And he said, "Well, you had to get on the bus to go to the next town to work. And I said to you, son, you want me to roll with it on the first set. And you said to me, 'No thanks, Dad, I'll do it myself.' And he said, 'You got on the bus.' He said, 'I watched the bus till it was out of sight, and he never looked.' And I realized that I robbed this man of what he did best, and that was to be a father. He said to me, he said, 'You never ever needed me.' He said, 'From then on, you bought all your own clothes, you paid your own money.' He said, 'All your brothers and sisters who went to college and to graduate school,' he said, 'they all let me help them.' He never bought a car until the last kid was out. He said, they let me help them, but you did it all on your own.' I thought, God, I'm sorry that I robbed you of what you did back. And a few months later, I needed to borrow a couple $1,000. And from that day to this, we've been like that. Mm-hmm. If you're new to Alcoholics Anonymous, if you ever stay with us, I can promise you great things will come about, things you can't understand. My mother, who was such a wonderful woman, and like I say, she passed away. And she died what some people would call a horrible death because she suffered greatly as the 6th month. She didn't see it as a horrible death. She believes that everything we do is a prayer, and particularly suffering. And she offered her suffering that her children would come back to God. Those are the way left. And she raised 11 of her own kids, and they raised kids who had no protest to go. And on her 50th wedding anniversary, they had 11 children, 20 grandchildren, and 20 great-grandchildren. And Mom died at home, and my sisters and brothers took care of her. And Julie and I would get up when we could. My brother Larry, he's all come with all his shit, lives in Romish, and she and I went up one night, and we were with her. She loved the rosary, and at night, when everybody was asleep, I'd come down and pray the rosary aloud. But some time to time, she would wake up and smile, and then drift back. And they put the picture of all the kids and everything on the wall, and she would look at that and smile. And she was pretty lucid one night, and my niece, who was in the fellowship, ran in, and she was all excited because her sponsor was going to be speaking, and she said, "Come and hear Barbara speak." And I said, "Well, I thought I'd stay with Mom." And my mother said, No, son. No. She said, "You go to that meeting. That's where you're supposed to be." He said, "Those are the people who brought you back to us." She loved Alcoholics Anonymous. And when I made amends to her, I asked her what I could do for her. She said only one thing. She give me one of those coins that they give you. And so every year I made a 13th Fender token. And when she listed the things that she wanted in her coffin when she died, the thing on her top of the list was my 23-year chair. Because you brought me back. That's all. My brother Terry, who died of Alzheimer's, sounds horrible, but it isn't that. I saw a guy walking the streets today, and I said to Julie, my body's scared. The guy was a dead ringers for my brother, who was on the streets, like I was on the streets, and he lived in the basement of places, like I lived in the basement of places. And 20 years ago, he went to Alcoholics Anonymous. He was for 90 days for whatever reason, America didn't have for Terry. What did have to Terry was that I tried to make amends for me, and he'd leave town when I went home, and he'd never let me around him, and I just yearned to make amends to my growth. And we went up to the 50th wedding anniversary, and I finally got an opportunity because who came to the 50th wedding anniversary drunk, and my brothers came to me and said, Terry's you're drunk. I said, of course he's drunk. He's an alcoholic. And they said, should we tell him to leave? And I said, good God, no. Now imagine Terry sitting down the street. Remember how it was? One more drink and then I'll go. One more drink and then I'll go. I said, he must love them a lot to come here like that. And I not only made amends to him, but I freed my brothers and sisters to love him just the way he was. He contracted cancer and ended up in the hospital, and I went to see him. And nobody leave me alone when I go home. They're always hanging around you, and so I told him I was moving to go home, and I ran over to the hospital and spent a couple hours to Terry, and we talked about stuff, and he asked me about the things we grew up with, about rosaries and about scapulars and things. I had to have a few, and I talked to him about it, and we just talked brother to brother for a couple hours, and he let me hug him. When I studied theology, there's a concept. For those of you who think it's over, you've wasted time. There's a concept in theology, and it has to do with time. And there are two kinds of time. There's chronos, chronological time, which is linear. And there's kairos, which is God's time. And God's time is always now. And that's why in the program they teach us for living in there. And I got to hug my brother Terry. He was frail, pretty sick guy, man, and pretty wasted away by cancer. But I got to hug him. You know how it is when you're an alcoholic, you can't hug much. I only hugged them for a few seconds, but I hugged them forever in God's time. And when I left, we were all right. And my family got to take them home. They got to nurse them and take care of them. They got to watch them come back into the church that meant so very much to them. They got to watch them die with dignity. Part of me. Great days will come down. Great days if you join us. There's a power that happens in Alcoholics Anonymous. Right there, it happens no place else. Don't get me wrong. I don't make a religion out of Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous is a way of life that frees me up to practice my religion, frees me up to practice my politics, frees me up to be a good husband, frees me up to be a father, frees me up to be all the things I want to be. I don't quote the big book like it's sacred scripture. You just don't do it. There's a guy who's always bugged you. He said, don't you believe it's God inspired us? Yeah, I think God had a lot to do writing that book. A drunk couldn't have written it. But he said, I think it's the inspired word of God. And he said, I think they ought to put numbers on it and chapters and things. And I said, well, what would it be? I said, would the pictures, would the personal stories be inspired? Yes. I said, well, after the first edition, they threw some of those stories out. I said, that's heresy. And he said, well, only the first 164 pages are inspired. I said, well, how about those ones that the I, V, the ones that Mike talked about? And are they inspired? Guy goes nuts. So I think we got to be careful about that. I think what Alcoholics Anonymous is about is a message. It's a way of life that we transmit one to another. And I want to close with this. And I talked too long, and I apologize. I'm just so excited about being here. But one of the things I like to do is you have a teaching hospital. And if you have a teaching hospital, go and talk to the interns, the young doctors who come. And I put on a coat and tie, and I went over and talked to them about Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, do you ever get a patient who wants to talk to someone in Alcoholics Anonymous? I'll come in and her. I got a call from somewhere, and this little doctor, and she said, it's probably a waste of time. There's a man here who won't talk to anybody, but I asked him if he had talked to a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he nodded his head. She said, so as you're not too busy, I said, I'll be right there. And I put on a tie, and I went over to our hospital, and if you, Michael, Dr. Tubal girl, that are, these regulatory stethoscope around the neck, she met you the doctor. And and not a high school student. And so she took me to this guy's meeting. She said, "Would you like to see his chart?" And I said, "No, I don't think I'm in this chart." I said, "I want to show him my chart." And went to his room, and she was going to make herself comfortable. And I said to her, "Would you please excuse me?" And it was a man laying in the bed, and he was a black fellow. He was laying in the bed, and he was looking at the ceiling, and he didn't acknowledge my presence. See? And I took out my chair, and I said, "My name's Keith, and I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. I understand he wanted to me to come over here," and he nodded his head. And I began to tell him my story. Now, that's all we do. We don't have any answers from anybody. I began to tell him my story, and I told him that I almost died on Harbor Street in Washington, D.C., and Ed Jorson looked at me and said, "When?" He said, "I could 1972. He said, I was living on Columbia Way, Washington, D.C. in 1936. I said, "Ontario Liquor. You used to go to Ontario Liquor Store." He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Remember the barrel where they had sweet fish for $10, the good stuff?" He said, "Yeah, yeah." And I told him, I said, "You know what I used to do?" I said, "I used to put on a sport coat and an ascot so nobody would think I was a bum." He said, "I put on a tie." And I remember I went in there one time, I was telling him, and I was holding up the bottle, three fists for $10. And I said to the guy behind the counter, "Tell me, sir, it's a pretty good vodka." And he said, "What the hell do you care? I'll get you where you need to go, And he said, "That was a nasty guy." I said, "Yeah, he really was." And we started talking, and pretty soon, and this little intern's wandering around back and forth and peeking in the crap of the deal, And this guy's sitting on the side of the bed, and we're talking as only alcoholics can talk to one another. And we're great friends. I mean, we're lifelong friends. We've known each other. We've known the degradation, fear. We've known each other forever. Our whole lives we've known one another. When we talked, and maybe Thomas should come back. And I said, "I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll bring another guy," and on and on. And I left, and this girl had gathered all the other interns together. And they were so excited. And she said, "And they had the most wonderful thing I've ever seen." She said, "That was magic." She said, "Would you do a workshop for us?" And I said, "Would you be willing to do some homework?" And she said, "Oh, of course." I said, "You got to drink real bad for at least 10 years. I was able to say to her, "This isn't about learning." I said, "This isn't it." I said, "You go on and be a great doctor." I said, "Because wherever you go, all you got to do is stick a name or a couple alcoholics, a man and a woman, who are active members in Alcoholics Anonymous from your count, and let them come into you. We need great physicians. You go be a great physician, and let us have the alcohol." I said, "God hasn't given me mankind, but He's given me the ability to speak to another alcoholic. And that's what you're going to have if you're new. Let's stay here. We'll have the ability to change the life of another human being. And once you watch it happen, you'll never go anyplace else. There's no action like this action." Again, I want to thank you so very much for your kind attention to and then stammer words. And again, I want to thank the committee and everybody associated here. God bless you, and I love you very much.